2 years ago, I set out to create the perfect animal room in my basement. I built it from the studs out with a specific goal in mind, to provide an awesome looking, safe space for the fish, frogs, and other creatures under my care. That was a lot of work, but the journey actually began decades earlier. I was still using many outdated components from those years, which made it impossible to reach my ultimate goal, especially in this area. That had to change. Theoretically, all I had to do was replace some old items, but it wasn't that simple. Instead, I had to rebuild and rework nearly everything that was running. However, what began as an effort to streamline the room became a different experience entirely. I didn't anticipate what secrets I'd soon discover in these mini worlds, like overgrown jungles, booming shrimp colonies, and so much more. When I consider maximizing these spaces, I always return to rack solutions. Stacking multiple enclosures makes all the difference, and it's not all that challenging or expensive. The primary consideration is that they must be able to support hundreds of pounds of fragile glass boxes full of water, plants, and priceless creatures that deserve the very best. No pressure. I've built my own for years, usually intending to hold as many enclosures as possible. That put many of the tanks close to the ground, which isn't ideal for maintenance or viewability. For what it's worth, these racks looked fine, but I knew I could improve them with additional steps. So I planned to rebuild them with a few goals in mind. Hold as many tanks as possible. Keep things elevated for ease of maintenance and viewing. Use building techniques that maximize form and function. And add much needed quality of life improvements. Building a solid rack from construction lumber like 2x4s is easy and cost effective. You just have to be picky, and I mean really picky when selecting the boards. I do have a complaint though, and that's their rounded edges. I think they make projects appear unfinished, but I usually don't bother removing them. I'd prefer to never rebuild these again, so I took the extra step to get rid of them. Otherwise, it would be one of those stupid little things that annoys me to no end. That meant more work up front, but it significantly reduced the sanding time later, which I'm all about. The simple butt joint has served me well when building these. No, not that. A connection between board surfaces without additional cuts. They make building quick, which is why I used them, but supporting boards or extra hardware is needed to hold heavy enclosures. Additional components means less space, more expense, and weight. That's partly why I wanted to use building techniques that maximize form and function. I considered the ways to build strong racks with less materials, and the obvious answer was notching the load-bearing posts. That makes a huge difference, and there are countless ways to produce them. I wanted things to remain consistent across all 16, so it was easiest to process them in batches. The old racks had visible fasteners, wood plugs, or putty. I wasn't about to do that here because they make for an unfinished look. All the front screws had to be hidden from view. Assembly is usually straightforward, but all that prep work allowed these to practically build themselves. Keeping things elevated for ease of maintenance and viewing was probably one of the most important goals I achieved with these bottom areas, which are the same for all 4 racks. I wanted the option to include canister filters because a few of the tanks already use them. However, they shouldn't be visible like this, and I gotta be honest, the tubing is pretty shady. Fixing that was a huge priority, but luckily they were running well. None of the shrimp, fish, snails, or other creatures were aware of this nonsense. Something I want to point out about the aquariums on canisters is how they illustrate the development of different environments. The lily tank on the bottom was fertilized many times, had a longer photo period, and a higher bioload relative to the water volume. To keep it looking good, it's received countless water changes and cleans in the 7 months it's been running. Meanwhile, the one above has only received 4 water changes with almost no maintenance in the past 10 months. I think that's mainly because the riparian plant growth helps filter the water, but the point is this: the way you set up an aquarium will dictate how frequently it needs maintained. However, the fact that I haven't maintained this tank in months shows because it's become a literal jungle. I wanted to address that before completing the racks, and the first thing I noticed was duckweed. It clung to the overgrown rotala along with the shrimp. There were 143 of them when they first entered this tank, and I was curious how much they had reproduced since. I'd get more insight into that later, but what made this tank appear as a jungle was the rotala. It was way longer than necessary and benefited from a good trim. I knew there was a lot, but I didn't expect to fill an entire bucket with stems. Aquarium plants usually arrive growing in rockwool net cups. I save them to propagate trimmings just like these. I simply bunch up a few stems in the rockwool and nestle them in a pot. They develop roots quickly, and I think this is a great way to reuse materials that otherwise would go to waste. However, it doesn't work with all plants, so a few of the others I had to trim became compost instead. Occasionally thinning growth like this helps maximize the aesthetic and encourages new leaves to form. The moss was also a little too wild and encroached on spaces it didn't belong. It would soon become a part of other setups instead. It looked better with a much needed haircut, but I didn't want to drain the water until it was ready to move. This tank had even more secrets to share, but I wouldn't discover those until I finished building. I didn't bother processing the boards that will be hidden, but I did remove the stamps and conceal their connection to the front. I wasn't as concerned with the back since you won't see it. I think it goes without saying that it took much longer to reach this point than with simpler techniques, but seeing the vision come together was fantastic. I always thought the others looked good enough. That may be true, but I also know that all the small details add up to make a complete harmonious picture, which is what I was attempting to do here. All that's to say, I took as many additional steps as possible without getting too into the weeds. I didn't want to see the edges on the plywood panels, which is why I routed out the openings. When I was cutting these out and doing a few other things, I was surprised to hear and see that a few friends stopped by to see what I was up to. I also cut the shelves out of plywood and they had to look official, so I veneered the edges. When combined, these things made better looking shelves, but I also wanted to add much needed quality of life improvements. The first was getting rid of the necessary but janky shim operations I've grown so accustomed to for a better long-term option, adjustable leveling feet. When I moved the first two racks into the room, I was honestly surprised at how much simpler it was to level them. I also had to drill a few holes for filtration before I could move the tanks. Easier said than done. Draining this tank was no issue other than being mindful not to vacuum anyone up. The challenge was actually moving the tank. To make a long story short, I thought I had a slick idea on how to do this, which you'll see in a moment, and it did work, but not as intended. Along the way, I made a different error. I forgot to clean the filter pads, which I hadn't done in months, making the tank look like this. I immediately did it afterward, and added some Max Out Pro, which would clean things up overnight in conjunction with water clarifier. Dirty glass was the only obstruction the next day, but I wouldn't get to that till a little later. I noticed the shrimp appeared to be more active after the move, which made me even more curious about their numbers. I wanted to get to the bottom of that, but I had to keep moving. The Blackwater Riparium was next. It too would be a challenge, but not for the same reason. It didn't have a fraction of the Hardscape, but it did have many beautiful riparian plants that I didn't want to ruin. Although this tank won't be up for much longer, I did want to enjoy it like this for a few more weeks. It's become a retirement tank for dozens of fish from other setups, but you'd never know that because of the obstructed view. I found it really charming how the spider plant sent off runners. It was also fantastic to see just how large the Syngonium grew. So this is essentially how I moved the previous tank, but this went a lot smoother. After draining it down, I aligned a standing desk with the edge of the stand and slid it on. Previously, the leveling mat kept sticking, which caused complications. Then I slid that over to the new rack, raised the table, and the rest was history. Even though I wanted to preserve the foliage, the canopy had to be thinned. This greatly increased the view into the waters beneath. I knew I wouldn't be so lucky if I tried to move a few of the others by myself and needed help to complete the job. Nate would arrive soon, but he couldn't stay for long, so I had to pick up the pace draining down the other IKEA tanks to make room for the next rack. This would hold many of the smaller tanks, which I moved on my own with ease. And just as I brought in the fourth and final rack, reinforcements arrived. There's absolutely no way I could have handled the no-filter guppy aquarium solo. We pulled it off with relative ease, but it was still a bruiser. When we went to get the others from before, I noticed something crazy. The plants grew so tall that they wrapped around the light. I had to trim those, and also removed a lot of excess Java moss in the waters. A pleasant surprise I didn't notice before is that the Photonia were blooming. Nate just left, but I'm making really good progress. I just have to get these few tanks over here, move to this rack, and button up a few things, but overall, looking pretty good. I never imagined reaching the 1 million subscriber milestone when I did, let alone coming up on 2 million now. The play button Paludarium is always a great reminder of how things have developed in the 3 years since. This is probably a good time to say that if you're new here and want to help me reach the next milestone, it would be greatly appreciated. Another tank that became an absolute jungle, and it was kind of fitting, is the Ancient Ruins Paludarium. Behind all that foliage was the spitting face statue. It just had to be rediscovered. I have to do this every few months, and it never gets old. It just makes me imagine finding the actual ruins of a lost civilization from times past. Wasabi's tank also needed a quick trim. However, this one made me sad because he's in his final days. Over the past year or so, he's been slowly declining, showing many telltale signs of age and betas. Luckily, he still eats well daily, but I have to show him where his food is, and he has stopped holding weight. Although he has an occasional burst of energy, he's primarily lethargic now, not even a fraction of how spunky he was years ago. You hate to see it, but it's a reality of life. A detail I couldn't address earlier was the plants in the dwarf frog tank. They were way too tall and blocked out much of the light. Hemigraphis looks fantastic and is probably one of my favorite plants, and it's super easy to propagate. I get much of it from this setup because it grows like a weed, but I can never seem to do my work in peace. Anyway, there's no reason to let the cuttings go to waste. I put them in water to keep them from withering before I have time to plant them. When I do, I simply wrap the ends of the stems with wet sphagnum moss and grow them in a terracotta pot. Like the Rotala, this is an easy way to build up a plant stockpile without spending additional money. One of the most frequent questions on the channel is probably in regard to the materials and products that I use to make these things, one of which has been this light. I think they're pretty sleek and they do a good job of growing plants. If it's something that interests you and you want to help support the channel, I'll leave an affiliate store link down in the video description. I get a little bit of kickback if you buy something, so it's a good way to support the channel if you're looking to buy these things anyway and allow me to continue making projects like this. One of the things I was most excited about was to move this Paludarium. It features a hardscape entirely made from firewood. After seasoning for many months, it was finally ready for animals, but I wanted to make a few alterations first. When I made this, I thought the high contrast created by white sand was the best look, but I grew to dislike it the more I saw it. It just looked off. After removing all of that, I went a completely different route. I laid a foundation of clay gravel substrate for plants, followed by a thick layer of dark sand. Its reddish-brown hues perfectly complemented the logs, lava rock, and plants. A few crypts helped bring it together, but the missing piece was spiderwood. They were part of the original design, but I took them out to use in a different setup while this one seasoned. I also felt that because this looks like a forest, it could benefit from some ground coverage. I gotta say, I enjoyed it before, but this was so much better. The new features looked perfect alongside the established ones, like moss sprouting up everywhere or the fern rhizomes slowly taking hold of the environment. Glowlight tetras are a beautiful fish, and I knew their stripe would look fantastic against the dark backdrop, especially as tannins develop. The old sand was full of beneficial bacteria, so it's a shame I had to remove it, but that's where TurboStart came in. I'm certain some remained on the hardscape, but this filled the gap with essential nitrifying bacteria to ensure the environment was suitable for life. While the fish settled in, I proceeded to finish the stands. The vision was already unfolding well, but the doors completed the look and included a quality of life improvement. Usually I'd use knobs or things like that, but instead I went with push magnet catches. They keep the doors shut, make opening them easy, and allow for everything to remain minimal in appearance. These new racks even took up less room while being overall more functional. However, I still hadn't cleaned the glass, and it showed. As I did, I noticed a lot of activity in this tank. The shrimp were everywhere, and the more I looked, the more I saw. Their numbers clearly hadn't decreased, but I was still curious to know how many inhabited this space. Without catching them all again, I'd never know for sure, but I knew a little incentive would help paint a better picture. Within seconds, the lolly was swarmed by a clan of hungry shrimp. As minutes passed, they emerged from this aquatic landscape with no end in sight. However, the heavies eventually caught wind of what was happening, and they meant business. They tried to bully the cherries out of the way, but they had strength in numbers and remained unfazed. This frenzy continued until every last morsel was meticulously stripped from the dowel. In less than 20 minutes, nothing remained. I'd say it's safe to assume they've grown in numbers, but we'll never know exactly what that means. I suppose some mysteries are better left unsolved. The waters below may only house a fraction of the shrimp seen here, but their numbers were beginning to increase as well. The babies were finally getting large enough to feel comfortable out and about with Samantha and the rest of the gang. She's the largest shrimp and likely their mom, but I can't confirm. The babies were too shy for food last time I tried, but I was curious to see if things would be different this time around. As before, there was immediate interest. The fish wanted a bite and the shrimp were already on the scene. This caused many of the once shy babies to emerge in droves. The fish went wild on one side, while shrimp feverishly picked at the food on the other. This went on for some time until eventually the Danios had enough. I knew even more shrimp were still hidden from view, but seeing the growing population feeding in unison was a joy. These are formulated for shrimp, and clearly they work. However, I was curious what they'd do in this unassuming 5-gallon Metaframe aquarium. It's the smallest in the room, yet it likely houses the most creatures of any setup, and I'm not talking about the Phoenix rasbora. I wondered if the scuds would flock to this. At first, there was nothing. Then some slight interest from a few of them, but they never came to it like the shrimp, which was unfortunate. Seeing all the characters emerge from the woodwork during feeding is always interesting. Some setups hold more life than others, but no matter what, you're bound to see something that wasn't there moments before. It may simply be more activity, or creatures that were previously hidden. In either case, the interplay between the animals and their homes is always magical. The reality of keeping so many tanks is that I rarely can observe all of these happenings daily. Having them in less than optimal areas low to the ground worsen matters more. Now I may have fewer spots for tanks, but the view and accessibility of the ones I have was greatly improved. All of that pushes me closer to my original goal of creating the perfect animal room, but much more needs done. It's cool to see how much the room has changed and improved in only a few weeks, especially when looking back at how it was even a year ago. If you want to see a full tour of the room and all the animals it houses, I'll link up last year's walkthrough and another video I think you'll enjoy. As always, thank you for your continued support, Serpa Squad. Take care and peace.